Okay, so I'm going to just give a brief intro to our interviewee today. David Edmund Moody, he's a PhD. He's a former director of the Oak Grove School, which was founded by Krishnamurti in Ojai, California in 1975. And we just learned, of course, David is still living there. In that capacity, he worked closely with both Krishnamurti and David Bohm for many years. He is the author of an uncommon collaboration. I just happened to have it, and I totally recommend this book for anyone who really wants to get some deeper background on the relationship that Krishnamurti had with David Bohm, which reviews the entire course of the relationship between the two men, including their many recorded conversations as well as their personal interactions. Moody also authored 2 additional books about Krishnamurti, most recently Krishnamurti in America, which I also recommend. I just finished it. Wonderful book. New Perspectives on the Man and His Message, as well as The Unconditioned Mind, J. Krishnamurti and the Oak Grove School. His primary interests revolve around the psychological observations and insights developed by Krishnamurti, especially as supplemented and refined by David Bohm. And that's what we're going to really zero in on. Oh, suddenly my view changed here. There we go. Oh, I see. We have speaker view. So David, I'd like to maybe start with just how you did get involved with the Oak Grove School and what your relationship was like with David Bohm and Krishnamurti. If you could kind of just give us that backstory.
Okay, well, let's see. I think we have about 2 hours available this morning, so that should be just about enough time to answer your first question.
Let's have the short version.
Distill it a little bit. Krishnamurti inaugurated the Oak Grove School, which is an elementary and secondary school, K through 12, in Ojai, California, where he had made his primary home since 1922. And so when he started the Oak Grove School, it was like the fulfillment of a dream that he had had for many, many years. He founded the school on property that was originally purchased by Annie Besant of the Theosophical Society. She came to Ojai in 1927 and bought several properties for Krishnamurti and his work. And so Krishnamurti finally started that school in 1975. And at that time, I was 28 years old, living in Los Angeles and very interested in Krishnamurti's work. And so I applied to teach at the school. And as it turns out, I was the first academic teacher hired. And for the first year of the school, I was the only academic teacher because we just had a small handful of students, and they were of elementary age, so it wasn't too hard to teach them all the academic subjects. And so that was the context in which I met Bohm as well, because beginning right from the very first year of the school, he started coming out to Ojai from England. He came, I believe, every year after the school opened. And maybe I should explain that context a little bit. You know, Bohm met Krishnamurti in 1961. Bohm read a book of Krishnamurti's called First and Last Freedom, which expresses the whole of Krishnamurti's philosophy. And so he reached out through the publisher, and the two men met, and they had an immediate sense of mutual rapport. And so they began communicating, meeting fairly regularly. And then in 1969, Krishnamurti opened the Brockwood Park School in England, not far from London, where Bohm was living. And Bohm was kind of instrumental in the opening of that school. And so it was a very natural progression for Bohm to continue to be engaged in Krishnamurti's work generally, and especially with respect to the schools. So when the Ojai School opened, it was a kind of a natural thing for Bohm to start coming out every year, which is what he did from 1975 until, well, Krishnamurti died in 1986. And at that time, Bohm's involvement in Ojai actually, instead of becoming less intense, became more intense, because he continued coming, and now it was not only for the purpose of, well, it was not any longer for the purpose of meeting with Krishnamurti, but instead Bohm began to conduct an annual series of seminars. There was a small group of us who arranged for him to conduct weekend seminars, about 10 hours altogether, in which he would present the whole of his views about the consciousness, human behavior, the whole psychological field, you know, what in that recent paper that you know, Bohmian psychology. And so those years from 1986 until 1992, when David Bohm died, were really the period of my most intense relationship with him and involvement in his work.
Very good.
And
Go ahead.
yeah, I'm curious just about you, David, in terms of what drew you first to Krishnamurti's work. And what in your background, or what was the interest you had that drew, and then your interest in Bohm's work. So what was in you that pulled you in that direction?
Okay, right. Well, you know, Krishnamurti is very often thought of as a religious teacher or some kind of spiritual person, and there's a sense in which that's true, but the great majority and kind of center of gravity of his work has to do just with ordinary human psychology, the actual dynamics of the everyday human consciousness. And that's what interested me. I was interested in psychology from a pretty early age, in my teenage years. And then I was an undergraduate at Berkeley in the late 1960s, and I wanted to major in psychology. But at Berkeley in that time, the psychology department was dominated by the philosophy of behaviorism. And behaviorism is a very peculiar way of approaching psychology, because the basic predicate of it is you don't need to study anything having to do with the mind. All you need to do is study, you know, stimulus and response, input and output of a pigeon or a rat or a human being. And I found this profoundly unsatisfying. And so I dropped out of, I didn't drop out of Berkeley, but I dropped out of the psychology major, and I started looking around for other ways, you know, other people who would approach the psychological field in a more meaningful and comprehensive way. And so, you know, I looked at all kinds of people, theorists of various kinds, until around 1971. Several people recommended to me that I have a look at some of Krishnamurti's works, and there it was. It was just such a revelation. It was the first person I saw who really developed a completely comprehensive view of the whole of human consciousness and all the parts of it and how they interrelated.
Can you say, David, especially since you ran the Oak Grove School, and I think you're also familiar with the school at Rockwood, how did Krishnamurti and even David Bohm, since David Bohm would visit Rockwood School quite often when he was in England, how did they really impact the school? What was their influence? How could you describe that?
Well, I would say that, you know, Krishnamurti's influence was stronger. He kind of laid down the basic principles of the school, you know, which had to do with developing the whole of the student, not having competition or comparison among students, you know, a strong emphasis on the relationship between teacher and student. Krishnamurti said there should be, you know, that various schools will say, well, we should try not to punish students, but very often they say instead we'll use reward instead of punishment. Krishnamurti said, no, those are equally bad. You don't use either reward or punishment to cultivate good behavior. You cultivate good behavior by having a good quality of relationship and helping students spontaneously want to behave well because they feel cared for. These are just a few of some of the principles, and the way he carried it out had a lot to do with meetings that he conducted with parents and staff. Krishnamurti spent about 3 months. He traveled around the world almost every year, but he spent about 3 months of each year in Ojai, and during those months he would conduct half a dozen or a dozen meetings with primarily with teachers, but also with parents, in which people were free to raise any questions that they liked. It was not, what you would think of as a Bohm dialogue, but it had some of the spirit of a Bohm dialogue because there weren't a lot of rules or, it was not highly structured or with a very fixed agenda. It was a kind of free and open forum for discourse among all the participants.
That was going to be my question. Did it seem like Krishnamurti was sort of edging into what we might call a Bohm dialogue in his meetings? And it sounds like that there were some similarities. Would Bohm do the same thing when he would visit Brockwood? Would he engage with the faculty in meetings like that?
Absolutely, exactly. And he did that at Brockwood. He also did that at Ojai to a lesser extent because he wasn't here as much as he had been at Brockwood, but he would conduct meetings. He was not explicitly trying to do what came to be called a Bohm dialogue. He was just having meetings with people in which mostly people would ask him questions about, Krishnamurti's philosophy is, as I said, is very broad, it's very comprehensive, and parts of it are quite subtle. And it's not at all clear to teachers how that is most appropriately adapted to the classroom situation. So a lot of questions came up of issues that puzzled teachers, and the opportunity to ask someone like Bohm to answer the questions was very appealing because Bohm was incredibly adept at answering whatever questions came up. And in some ways it was much more satisfying to ask Bohm these questions because he would answer, he would tell you what the answer was to your question. Whereas if you ask Krishnamurti, he would be more likely to kind of turn the question back and say, what do you think? And challenge you in some way further. Whereas Bohm would just say, oh, okay. And, reel off a 3-minute or 5-minute answer and tell you what you wanted to know.
Nice.
If I can just interject here a little bit, if you don't mind. I once complained to Krishnamurti in a private meeting with him. I said, you ought to consider sometime in some of these group meetings doing what Bohm does whenever somebody asks him a question. He explains the answer to the question. I kind of suggested that Krishnamurti should do something similar. And he reacted rather negatively. He said to me, is that what you want? Explanations? And I said, no. And I didn't correct it after that.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. When you were talking about Bohm in your article and in the book, you talked about how influenced he was by Hegel and Piaget and Freud and Krzyzewski. And particularly, you said he went to those works because he was interested in the conditions for freedom in individuals and in society. So help me understand what freedom meant in that sense to Bohm. Why this interest in freedom, and how did those authors inform his ideas about freedom?
Okay, that's a pretty deep question. I think before I get into how Bohm saw it, I mean, Bohm, okay, let me just explain a little bit of background. So Bohm was born in 1917, in December of 1917. So he was born in a little town in Pennsylvania called Wilkes-Barre, which was kind of a coal mining town, not very prosperous. And so in 1929, when the Great Depression began, Bohm was 12 years old. He was just kind of coming of age. And, the 1930s, the Depression years, were his teenage years. And he developed kind of a radical view of politics at that time. And so I think his original notions of freedom had a political orientation, political, economic, and, as is pretty well known, he got interested in Marxism, as kind of a, today we associate Marxism and communism, we associate it with totalitarianism, we associate it with the antithesis of freedom. But in those days, in the late 1930s, 1940s, to many people, intellectuals, especially in the United States, it seemed like Marxism was an avenue for freedom, precisely for freedom, and that was the basis of their interest in it. But it was a political, economic, social kind of freedom. And so when Bohm got interested in Krishnamurti, I think another dimension developed, because freedom was essential to Krishnamurti's work also. When Krishnamurti broke away from the Theosophical Society and went his own way, he said he was breaking away from theosophy. He didn't want to have anything to do with organized religions of any kind. But he said he did have a goal, a specific thing that he wanted to do in life. He said he was going to do it with unwavering determination. And that thing was to set human beings free. But what he meant by freedom was not any ordinary kind of freedom. He was talking about psychological freedom, which is a very different thing. It's an inner freedom. It's something much more subtle and not obvious. What is the meaning of that? And so then when Bohm got interested in Krishnamurti's work, I'm sure that he developed, this deeper and more expanded sense of the meaning of freedom as something which is more an inward thing, but a freedom from conditioning, a freedom from the restrictions that are psychological restrictions that are imposed by society, culture, family, and that sort of thing.
Yes, they both seem to land on this idea that it's really the culture that we have to get free of, right? It's really the cultural conditioning that forms the basis of memory, thought, right? So they both went down that rabbit hole, and very few other psychologists have gone down that, which is why I think you come on so strongly about how, in a way, they really have revolutionized the field of psychology, although not very many psychologists know of their work.
Yes, it's a very profound and fundamental idea, psychological freedom. The notion in itself is almost revolutionary, really, because it is so common to think of freedom as, something external, freedom of action, freedom of behavior, civil rights, what have you. And to make psychological freedom kind of the foundation of your whole point of view is very unusual. And yes, culture, you say culture, freedom from the culture, but culture conceived very broadly. It includes education, it includes what happens in the family, it includes what you pick up over television and movies and popular songs. It comes in from many different directions.
Right. Yeah. Just to stay on that a little bit, and then I'll throw it back to you, Nancy. I'd love you to go into the idea of time, how time and the thinker and thought all kind of interact in that same way to create a sense that we're not free, but actually if we get the right understanding of those things, then that kind of gets at the heart of what I think Krishnamurti was trying to say and that Bohm picked up on.
Okay, wow, yeah, time is such a fundamental part of Krishnamurti's work and also of Bohm's work, and it's something that they discussed a great deal together. In fact, they had, the two men had many dialogues together, and about several dozen of their dialogues together were recorded. And there was one series of dialogues in particular that took place in 1980 that was published as a book, and it's really the most memorable existing artifact, if you will, of their work together. And that book is called The Ending of Time. But the title is a little bit confusing because it sounds something sort of weird. It sounds like the ending of time by the clock, you know, some sort of science fiction-y notion. But that's not what it means. Krishnamurti distinguished between ordinary time, chronological time, and what he called psychological time. They're very different notions. And psychological time is a subtle notion, but it has to do with, you can think of chronological time as the time in which the physical world takes place. Krishnamurti said time is measurement, and chronological time is the measurement of how long it takes a physical object to get from here to there. Whereas psychological time is something, is when I want to become something, when I want to become freer, or I want to become enlightened, or I want to become wise, or I want to become wealthy or famous. And it's that process of psychological becoming that Krishnamurti and Bohm refer to as psychological time. And Krishnamurti felt that that movement of wanting to become is the source of a great deal of difficulty and conflict and confusion. And this also is a very radical notion, because especially, you know, here in the United States, you know, we're all kind of devoted to the notion of self-improvement of various kinds. And Krishnamurti is so radical. He says, no, it's that very urge that where you have an ideal of what you want to become. He says that's the source of conflict, which didn't mean that he didn't want to precipitate change. Psychological change was also very important, but he said the real change doesn't come about by having an ideal or image of what you want to achieve. He says that only leads to conflict. And that's where psychological time comes in. It's the time, it's the gap between what I am and what I think I want to become. And Krishnamurti and Bohm felt that in that gap occurs all kinds of conflict and mischief and disorder.
Yeah, relating to the ego, which doesn't really exist in Krishnamurti's philosophy, right?
Yeah, it exists in a sense. It's an illusion. Bohm said it's like a rainbow. It's an appearance of something, but it does not have the same concrete reality as a mountain or a lake or another human being.
So in many of the recordings I've seen of Bohm, many which are on the Academy website and others in your book, Bohm seems to be saying that he went into science because he thought that would save the world from poverty. That was his sort of impetus for, but that he discovered as he worked in science that wasn't going to happen. That first of all, poverty wasn't the main problem, and secondly, he wasn't going to save the world or help the world that way. And so he turned to this other idea, and you've already talked a good deal about that other idea, that it is the way we think and the assumptions we make and the influence of culture and so forth. But as I read his books and his writing, that it seems to me the only solution he gives for solving that then is this idea that we need to come together in fairly large groups. He says 20 to 40 people, and have these conversations, and that we need to have them like weekly over a period of a year or more, you know, in order before it even helps us begin to think differently. And that seems like an impossible solution. It seems like I don't think we're ever going to get there with that solution. So I guess I'm just reflecting on that and just wondering about your, is that the only way that Bohm is saying we can solve this, is these really very long range conversations?
Okay, so let me try to answer that in the context of the seminars that Bohm conducted at every year at Oak Grove School after Krishnamurti died, starting in 1986 and then going through to 1990, 1991. I think there were 5 or 6 seminars altogether. So these seminars, we about 50 or 60 people would come, and Bohm would speak for a couple of hours on Friday evening, and then Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, about 10 hours altogether. And in those seminars, he was laying out his understanding of the whole field of human psychology. Dialogue, the notion of dialogue, he would include that as a portion of that much broader field, but it was just a portion. I liken it to a peninsula attached to a continent, where the continent is the whole field of consciousness, which is what he laid out in most of the 10 hours of a weekend seminar. And the kind of dilemma that, or disorder that he described in the seminar, which is the human condition, the lot of each one of us, is a series of confusions, misunderstandings, illusions about the process of thought, the way thought functions. And the solution to it really has to do with just being fully aware of the problem. It's seeing and understanding the nature of the problem, which itself can precipitate freedom, in the same way that if you are suffering from some kind of illusion, if you can see the nature of the illusion, that's what breaks you out of it and frees you from it. And so it's the very process of listening and understanding the dilemma that he describes, which is the basis for stepping out of it. And dialogue is kind of a supplement to that process. Dialogue is not like the sole remedy for everything he described. It's kind of in terms of the context of what he put forth in the seminars, dialogue is kind of a supplementary activity which can contribute and facilitate the primary work being my understanding of myself, for which I don't necessarily need a group at all. In fact, the main energy and source of that work is my own observation of myself in relationship with other people. Krishnamurti said, relationship is the mirror in which you see yourself. You don't just go off and isolate and understand yourself. You see yourself in relationship to people, to ideas, to situations. And that's the primary work. The dialogue process is kind of a supplement and maybe to some extent a catalyst for that kind of work.
I think you
very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
You definitely clarified for me something that I think probably many people who practice Bohm dialogue don't fully understand or appreciate maybe about Bohm's work, which is that it's not really about developing better relationship skills, although that can be part of it. That can be an outgrowth of practicing dialogue. But what Bohm was really trying to do was to help groups see into the conflict, the inevitable conflict, when one holds onto one's thought about reality that may or may not be true, because we can't see. Our thought is what in fact divides us, right? So in the process of dialogue, it kind of helps to, it gets at his notion of proprioception, I guess. Proprioception, which is the idea that we know when we raise our hand where it is in space, but we don't always know what our thoughts are doing inside, because our thoughts can be tacit and they can build up over many levels of assumptions. So I think what he was trying to do in dialogue was to give us a process, which Krishnamurti never really gave us a process, right?
No, he avoided it like the plague.
He avoided it like the plague, whereas at least Bohm said, okay, here's something you can try. It may be like climbing Mount Everest, you write in your material, but it at least is a way that we can begin to get at it, right?
Exactly. And okay, you raised so many points there. Let me just come to one of them to elaborate a little bit on the notion of proprioception. Proprioception is kind of a complicated word, but it essentially just means a self-awareness, awareness of oneself. And proprioception, physical proprioception, our self-awareness of the body, is something which is so ingrained that we take it utterly for granted and never think about it. But it's an important property of the nervous system, of the way our brains and nervous system function, which is that, as you say, if I move my arm, I know that I moved it. Somebody else didn't move it, I moved it. And I get that feedback from the nervous system very immediately and concretely and directly. And the reason this is relevant is because in Bohmian psychology, he says thought does not have that property. Thought is not proprioceptive. When thought functions and acts, it does so in such a way that we're not aware that thought is moving. And so Bohm says that thought moves into perception and shapes perception in ways of which we're not aware, because thought is not proprioceptive, and therefore our thoughts infiltrate, in a sense, our perceptions and make us think that we're seeing something outwardly, objectively, as if it really exists, when really it just comes from our memory, our background, our knowledge, our thought. And Bohm, very often, he gave an interesting, Bohm was so good with metaphors and examples, and to illustrate proprioception, he very often mentioned the story of a woman who he claimed he knew, who had a stroke in the middle of the night while she was sleeping. And this particular stroke had a peculiar effect, which was that it shut off or canceled the sensory receptors in her arm, so she could no longer feel anything in her arm. But it didn't cancel the motor function of her arm. She could still move it. And so she was asleep in the middle of the night, and she felt something touching her face, and she didn't know what it was. And so she started struggling against it. And the more she struggled against it, the more she felt like it was attacking her. And this created kind of a vicious circle. It got worse and worse until finally she turned on the light and gradually realized that it was her own arm that she was struggling against, because she had lost the proprioception in her arm by virtue of this stroke. And Bohm says that's what happens with thought all the time. Thought is acting and moving and creating effects that we're not aware come from thought, come from memory, come from knowledge. And so then we struggle against those effects without realizing what the source of them is. And so that's the metaphor he used to explain what is not the only, but one of the many sources of confusion and disorder that arise from the thinking process.
I have one quick question. We know that Krishnamurti certainly impacted Bohm, and we know that Bohm helped to clarify much of Krishnamurti's work, as you had said earlier. How would you say that Bohm impacted Krishnamurti's work, or did he?
Oh yes, I think he did. They had, as I mentioned before, they had many conversations together, and those conversations they had the spirit of a Bohm dialogue. It wasn't 20 to 40 people, but it had that, what he called a free flow of meaning. in which the people engaged with one another without a sense of defensiveness or trying to, you know, verify their own position or convince somebody of something. And so in that process, you know, Krishnamurti was open to Bohm's point of view just as much as Bohm was open to Krishnamurti's point of view. It really was a free flow of meaning, and you can pick up the sense of that if you listen or read some of those dialogues. And so I think it was a, part of it was a process of just clarifying some of the things that Krishnamurti said. Bohm had a great facility for seeing how things that Krishnamurti would say would be received by somebody who was not terribly familiar with that philosophy. And so Bohm could pinpoint and say, you know, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Or, you know, if you say that, it's going to be confusing and lead people to think such and such. And Krishnamurti welcomed that. He liked that. And so that was one way in which, you know, Bohm contributed. But there was more than that. There was a whole series of dialogues where Bohm got very interested in conveying. Bohm wanted to convey to Krishnamurti the meaning, kind of a deeper meaning of certain fundamental terms, truth, reality, and actuality. Bohm was very interested in the root meanings of words, and he felt that the way those words are commonly used was not entirely faithful to their root meanings or to Krishnamurti's philosophy. So he tried to share those views with Krishnamurti, and Krishnamurti was quite receptive and adopted Bohm's approach, which was not entirely welcomed by some of the people who were closest to Krishnamurti and were accustomed to his the way he had used words previously. It led to various kinds of conflict, but that's another long story that I probably don't want to go into right now.
I have one more question, Nancy, and then you're totally.
Please go ahead.
So do you feel now that Bohm's work and Krishnamurti's work, for that matter, are becoming better known? You make several claims in your books that, you know, it's a fundamentally different way of looking at psychology that they both brought. And for many reasons, maybe because Krishnamurti was thought to be an Eastern mystic, which was not really true. His work was not discovered. Do you feel that that's kind of coming out of the closet now more? And if so, who's picking it up? Or is anyone?
As far as I can tell, that's not happening. And if anything, it seems to be going kind of in the other direction. You know, when Krishnamurti was alive and present and going around and giving talks on college campuses, and, you know, he spoke, you know, in big auditoriums in San Francisco and New York and Washington. You know, it was easier to sustain some degree of interest in his work. But, you know, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone in the United States, where I think there really is, you know, a reluctance to take seriously the work of anyone with a name like Krishnamurti, especially someone who's, you know, who's supposed to be an Indian teacher, which sounds to people like, you know, a mystic and a guru. And so there's a lot of resistance to taking his work seriously. On the other hand, one countervailing indication is, you know, there was this film that was recently released. I don't know how many of the people here are aware of it, but this documentary film about Bohm's work. You know, it's focused on Bohm's work, and Krishnamurti is brought into it only indirectly by virtue of the fact that Krishnamurti was important to Bohm. This film is called Infinite Potential. It's a documentary. It's available now, and it has received quite a bit of, you know, it's been pretty widely distributed. It's received a lot of good attention, and I think this has kind of precipitated some degree of upsurge in the interest in Bohm's work, especially. Krishnamurti's work, maybe a little bit as a derivative of that. But overall, I think I have to say that the large-scale trend of events since 1986, when Krishnamurti died, has been lessening of interest in his work, which is very unfortunate because it's so relevant and germane to, the actual issues which are confronting each one of us individually as well as socially, society at large.
Right now, yeah.
Right now, absolutely.
Nancy, do you have any other questions?
Just to thank David, and also just to acknowledge your that your books, recent books, and you've been publishing around both Krishnamurti and Bohm, are certainly, I think, helping to bring their ideas to light. So our thanks for your work in that area, and with the Pari Center as well. I don't know if you'd like to say just a word or two about the Pari Center before we move into our breakout groups.
Okay, sure. Well, this goes back to David Peat. David Peat was a scientist, but he was primarily a science writer. And his background was in physics, and he became interested in Bohm's work in physics. And then he became very friendly with Bohm. And they had a lot of conversations together. They wrote a book together called Science, Order, and Creativity, quite an interesting book. And then after Bohm died, David Peat wrote what is really the only full-scale biography of Bohm. And his book is called Infinite Potential, The Life and Times of David Bohm. And it includes the story of Bohm's life as well as a great deal of attention to Bohm's ideas, especially in physics and what's called the implicate order, which is Bohm's cosmology. And David Peat was an Englishman who lived also in Canada, and then more towards the end of his life, he moved to a little town in Italy called Pari, P-A-R-I. And that's where he met Paul Howard, who was the documentary filmmaker who created the film Infinite Potential. It was a joint idea of David Peat and Paul Howard to create this film. And so the film has the same name as the same title as the book, the biography that Peat wrote of Bohm. And so then David Peat formed this center called the Pari Center, which is a place in this little town in Italy for people to come together and discuss various ideas, not only Bohm, that's an important part of it, but various other ideas of general interest and currency to quite a few different people. David Peat died in, David Peat died in 2017, I think, but his work and the Pari Center is being carried on by his wife and his daughter and a few other people who are still very interested in it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. What we're going to do now is to break into small groups, and what we'd like you to do in those small groups is just to think about together about what David has said. If you generate some questions, there'll be time after that to ask those, but we'd also be interested if you generate some ideas so that when we come back, we'll be interested both in your thinking, your comments, as well as your questions. So I'll ask Bobby if she will move us now into small groups, and then we'll be back in about 20 minutes with David.
Maria, I'm wondering if you would start out with your question. That's a very broad one, and I think it might help to get us all started. You're on mute.
And I just unmuted myself. The first part of the question?
Sure.
The first part, yeah. In our small group, we wondered what David Bohm and Krishnamurti would say about what is happening in the United States right now. How would they describe it? How would they comment on it? So perhaps David can extrapolate and see. Yeah.
You're on mute, David. David, you're on mute. There you go.
Better?
Yeah.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yes. How would they respond or look at the events happening here? So, you know, Krishnamurti's, as I've said, his philosophy was very broad and comprehensive, also very detailed. He went into great detail about all kinds of issues. But there was one issue in particular, one statement that he often made, which he referred to as a law. I think it's the only one that I can think of in all of his teaching, which he called a law. So I refer to it as Krishnamurti's law. He said, where there is division, there must be conflict. Where there is division, there must be conflict. And I think for Krishnamurti, that would be the kind of the essence of what is taking place in this country at this time. There's such extreme polarization, and the division is a division of alternative realities fundamentally. We have, you know, we live in two completely different worlds, really, from a political, social, economic, civil rights point of view, as you can see from, you know, alternative cable TV stations and so on. Bohm might look at the same thing in a slightly different way. I think Bohm would talk in terms of fragmentation, how the culture is fragmented, different parts competing and isolated from one another. You know, he said the dialogue is designed to cultivate, you know, a free flow of meaning, but in the culture at large, there is no free flow of meaning because the different pockets of people are isolated, separated from one another, and within their separate pockets, they have a free flow of meaning, but they don't. One fragment does not communicate very well with the other, and this relates to why he wanted to develop the kind of dialogue which he described. You know, there's a kind of a feeling or an assumption or an implicit idea that Bohm dialogue is a kind of a forum for harmony and cooperation and mutual understanding and all that sort of thing. But all of that really kind of comes later. The beginning of a Bohm dialogue is quite different. Bohm said you should have a minimum of 20 people because it's very important for the underlying disagreements that people have to come out and surface. He said, if you only have 7 or 10 or 12 people, he said, there's a very strong tendency for people to be polite and spontaneously try to agree with one another. He said, you have to watch out for what he called a cozy adjustment with one another. And he wanted to have at least 20 people so that you could guarantee there would be a robust amount of disagreement and the underlying different assumptions and different points of view, which is different fragments of the culture, would come out and be exposed, and people could start learning about their own assumptions and how that is contributing to the general fragmentation.
I'll turn to Ed Hoffman, and Ed, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, so we were talking, I think it came from Sharon, but in our small group, we see the juxtaposition between what we've been talking about, which I think represents deep thinking, reflection, respect for others, conversation, and uniqueness. And you talk about that having that space, not to be cozy in agreement, but to disagree. And yet we're living in a world that values speed agility, fastness, and the use of algorithms that allow us to listen to ourselves and others like us. And Sharon brought up the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma,
Yeah.
which is very frightening. But basically, I see it as kind of like a Matrix environment. If you remember the Matrix movie, for those who saw it, basically you have people who don't think, they don't they don't have conversations, but they're satisfied because they think that everything is happening the way they want them. They're being reinforced by the same notions. So we talk to the same people, we get linked to the same messages, we think we're right, and that means that everybody else is wrong. So I guess we were trying to figure out how would you relate a social dilemma type world we're currently in with David's work and these concepts?
Right. Yes, I saw that documentary, the Social Dilemma. It really is very well done and so astute in explaining, you know, at least one of the sources of our current difficulties. You know, there's a great irony associated with the internet and social media of all kinds. The irony is that, in principle, these technologies should facilitate and do facilitate tremendous increase in communication among people of all kinds and all over the world. But the irony is that instead of working to bring people together, it's working to fragment people, because although there's a great increase in communication, as that film, The Social Dilemma, points out, the algorithms, which means the procedures which are built into platforms like Facebook especially, but a number of others, they function to put people in contact with other people who already share their own point of view, and to isolate you from people who don't share your point of view. And so instead of increasing mutual understanding, it tends to exacerbate the isolation and fragmentation of one group from another, so that this great engine of potential mutual understanding is kind of working against itself. So that is seems to be a source, one of the sources of our current difficulties.
Yeah.
Another way of getting at this is a question that Lloyd, you asked in your statement. Can you offer that up to David? And you're on mute, Lloyd.
Yes. I appreciated your sharing when you were talking about at the school that one of the things you appreciated about Bohm was that he would answer your questions, where Krishnamurti resisted that, and that part of that was how to. And I appreciate having brought up, you know, the social dilemma. And I asked the question, how might we approach bringing psychological freedom? Because our focus so much has been in this country on political freedom, the political freedom for each of us to do whatever we want to do, and not realizing how that imprisons us in these small silos, as it were. So do you have any suggestions on how we might approach bringing psychological freedom into the political realm, which at this time is so anchored in fragmentation?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, you know, one of the basic principles there, maybe the fundamental principle, is, you know, you don't begin with how can I bring freedom to the world or to my culture, to my society. You begin with how can I bring freedom to myself? How can I find my own freedom? And if my own approach to life is predicated on genuine freedom, if I can find my way to that, then that will spontaneously kind of manifest in the quality of my relationships with other people and spill over into society in that manner, so that it's my own behavior, it's my own state of mind and my own relationships, which then inevitably affect those around me. Beyond that, you know, if one has an insight or an understanding which is communicable, you speak, you tell people, you share it, you open it up, you participate outwardly in that same way. But the foundation has got to be inward, within yourself. And if you have that psychological freedom inwardly, then it will find a way to manifest and communicate itself to other people.
I like that answer, David. That's a hopeful answer.
It's not an easy or obvious thing. The psychological freedom is not something that you get with a method or an easy answer. It really takes penetrating, especially observation and understanding of oneself and learning how one's own mind works and what are the limitations which are embedded deep in your thought processes.
Thank you. Naleki, would you made both a comment and you asked a question. Would you unmute and talk to David about one or the other of those?
Sorry, you asked me, Nancy?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's an addition on the first two questions. And my main question, maybe to David, but maybe to others also, is it possible in these times, this time where we all live in bubbles and polarization, is it still possible to hold these big dialogues without a topic? And what will come from it? And how, is there anyone who has experienced this, facilitating this dialogue, maybe David himself, in these times? Is it still possible? And does it help our actual problems?
If I understand you correctly, are you saying, can there be a dialogue without a topic? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, because that's, I have held a lot of dialogues with around wicked problems and the topic, and everyone is then committed to it. But what I have learned from David Bohm, that he just starts with a dialogue and see what pops up. And well, it takes a lot of time, I think, but there comes totally different things from it, and maybe it helps, but I'm not sure if there's anyone holding these dialogues anymore in these times. And yeah.
Well, yes, no, I think that you know, there are different kinds of dialogue. There are different approaches to it. But if you want to talk about what we could call kind of pure Bohm dialogue as it was originally conceived, you know, there were certain principles of no leader, no facilitator, no fixed agenda, which is, I think, what you're getting at. No necessity to come to any conclusions or decisions. But the fact that there's no predetermined topic or no fixed agenda doesn't have to mean that, you know, the dialogue doesn't have a topic. The topic is, you know, what's on people's minds, what are concerning people today, now, and I will say what's concerning me, and you'll say what's concerning you and somebody else, and then, you know, it's like a ping pong ball going back and forth. That, you know, something emerges, something develops. But the idea is that there's no fixed agenda. There's no strict limitation. You know, you don't come to a point where you say, okay, you can't bring that up because it doesn't fit into our program. Whatever is relevant and germane to the people participating is open for discussion.
Okay, thank you. And do you have any experiences with it yourself in these actual times with polarization? And so it's so difficult now to get people to just talk quietly together and see if we can reach each other.
I haven't participated in that kind of dialogue group for quite a few years. I have to say that years ago when I did participate, I found the whole process to be somewhat problematical. I don't know if you want to get into that aspect, but to me there are some difficulties in the process that never got fully resolved. So I kind of moved away from it in more recent years. If you like, I can talk about what I perceive to be the difficulties, but that might take us, I don't know, far afield or not relevant to what people want to talk about.
I think that might be useful. David, why don't you say at least a couple of minutes on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, the difficulties that I perceived in the dialogue groups that I participated in, they were twofold. The fundamental difficulty, it sounds silly to say it in a way because it seems like something that should be easily overcome, but it wasn't. So there's no facilitator, really. There might be somebody who initiates it, but there's not somebody who's managing the course of the conversation. And so the issue is, well, who gets to speak and who gets to speak next? And the way the dialogue typically works is whoever is speaking now kind of has the floor, and it's kind of understood that it's not appropriate to interrupt that person. And so then, but when that person stops speaking, who gets to speak next? And the way the dialogue groups that I've been involved in tend to function is that when one person is finished speaking, the person who gets to speak next is the person who's quickest to get in, in a microsecond after the previous person has finished speaking. And some people are very good at that. It's a skill which I personally don't have. Some people can see, exactly when it is that the other person is done speaking, and in a millisecond they get in and start speaking and say what they want to say. And if you don't have that skill, like I don't, then you never get an opportunity to speak, because there's just a few people who end up kind of dominating the conversation because they always have something they want to say and they're always very quick to get in. And so that obstructs, the essential spirit of the dialogue, which is, a free flow of meaning. So that's the most important problem. There's a secondary problem, which is, as you said, there's no fixed topic or fixed agenda. And I've noticed that in the groups that I participated in, very often the conversation kind of circles around to the process of dialogue itself. And, the question often comes up, are we doing it properly? Or, somebody will say, well, what you just said is not in the spirit of the dialogue. And so then that raises the question, is this the real dialogue, or is this Bohm dialogue, or are we doing it correctly? And that's not there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think it's quite the thing that was basically intended when Bohm developed the whole concept.
And I'll just add, Naleka, a lot of the groups have evolved so that there are guides, and some of the problems that David's bringing up, we have kind of resolved them once you understand and have, integrated the guides into the group. So that enough of, we can talk more about that outside. I'm wondering, Thomas Kurtner, if you could offer your question. It kind of relates to current events a bit, and also the idea of conflict. And I think it would be a useful question. And you're on mute.
Yes, thank you, Linda. That was one of the interesting aspects in what you mentioned, David, and what came up in terms of dialoguing for reducing conflict, right? And as an ideal of non-fragmentation in some way in Bohm's perspective, yet conflict seems to be an essential part of evolution in nature, right? Nature itself, in system life. The major conflict may have been that we have detached ourselves from the rest of nature somehow. So are we talking about human conflict? What would be basically the deeper meaning David Bohm would give to the term conflict, right? Where is it about conflict or is it about confrontation, what we want to reduce? How do we relate to conflict actually?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There's a man I know who's he's actually a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation, and he's a scientist. He's a scientist in several fields, but one of them is the biological sciences. And he can't understand why Krishnamurti is so against conflict, and for reasons quite similar to what you just described. He says, you know, the whole process of evolution is based in large measure upon conflict between species and, you know, between individuals within a species. And so how can you you know, isn't conflict an important element in development and transformation? So it's quite an interesting puzzle. And I think that part of the answer is that almost everything that Krishnamurti talks about is strictly within the psychological field. He's not talking about conflict in an evolutionary sense. He's talking about inward conflict when one part of me is opposed to another part of me. And what he says about that fundamentally is that it's a wastage of energy. It's a wastage of energy. He says that in order to have a deep perception and understanding requires a great deal of energy. In fact, Krishnamurti describes religion in a very unusual way. He's very against organized religion, but the real kind of religion that he would advocate, he describes as a gathering of energy to see what is true. And he says conflict is a wastage of energy. That's the problem with it. You know, it's not like it's morally wrong or anything of that nature. It's that it's inefficient inwardly in the psychological field. And so conflict may have a different meaning or a different function outwardly between species and in an evolutionary sense. But the kind of conflict that he's referring to is that psychological conflict within me and also within, you know, between people. And, you know, especially in the United States, competition is built into the economic system as well. But when conflict is psychological and entails a division between human beings, then it leads to various kinds of not just inefficiencies, but disorder and ultimately violence and war, which, you know, is the most disorderly thing that you could have.
Yes, if we have time for one more question, Zafnat, if you could just kind of scrunch down all of your comments into just maybe one question around the self, that might be useful and a good place to end.
Okay, wow. Yeah, there's so many things to say. And I think what you just talked about, how Krishnamurti saw conflict, says it all. I mean, I think that the focus on the self so much when we're talking about a relational phenomenon, it is the problem. This is exactly the problem. And I'm not against delving into the self, but sentences like relationships are a reflection, are a mirror of self. Doesn't it go the other way? Self is a mirror of relationships. Where does it start? It's different, we can talk about where does it start. It's not now. We don't have the time for that. And I would say, let's just look at things from a hybrid conceptualization. It doesn't matter where it starts, but I think we all experience that it goes both ways. And if it does go both ways, we cannot focus so much on the self, because this is the separation. This is what creates the isolation. And then you're saying there's no flow of meaning because people are in their pockets of meanings. This is the problem, because we emphasize the self so much, not looking at the context and where we are embedded in. Even Krishnamurti and Bohm were embedded within an individualist culture. So they had to raise their heads and see, wait a minute, what is the water we are swimming in? Maybe we need to paradigmatically change how we understand our relationships. But this keep going into it perpetuate isolation. And I think we are doing, it's bad for us. And I'm not against looking inside. I'm a psychologist myself. But we must shift a little bit. And I wrote one sentence there, I can't find it now, where I'm saying, if we can understand our relationship as much as we understand the self, we went one step forward. We have so many concepts and research about the self.
So Sapna, can I ask you to kind of end with that so that we can have a short response from David? Because we're needing to close here.
You're asking me to ask the question?
If you've got a quick question, yeah.
Yeah, I do. I have a question. I ask, did you ever discuss in your groups the essentialist meaning of how you see the self? Did you have a discussion about that? Because this is what gets us stuck in the isolation. So this is one question, but I had a few. Thank you.
Okay, so the way I would approach this, I would come at it I would look at it in terms of the broader context. That the issue of the self is one manifestation, maybe a central manifestation, but it's just one manifestation of a broader issue that Bohm very much brought into focus in his work. And that has to do with the process of thought, the thinking process. The difficulties we have with the self is just a manifestation of some confusions which are embedded in the process of thought itself. Bohm, the one book that Bohm has published in this field is called Thought as a System. And this is really where the focus needs to be. It's on the entire field of thought and how thought functions. And when he says thought as a system, it relates to what we're talking about, the social dilemma, how thought is something, we ordinarily think of thought as just this, little thing which is going on in my head at the moment. But Bohm says thought is a system. It flows throughout throughout my whole body. It affects the emotions and the chemistry of the body, and it flows between you and me right now, and it flows throughout all of society. So thought is functioning as a system. It's that systemic element and the confusions and illusions which are embedded in the systemic nature of thought, of which the self is one manifestation. It's kind of a central manifestation, and many different roads lead to it, but it can't really be understood apart from its broader context of the whole field of thought and the misunderstandings that we have about how thought functions.
Thanks, David. Great response. So Nancy, I think we're going to move on.
That we are indeed. And what I want to do now is tell you about the next interview we're having, which is on February 26th, in which Hugh Pigeon is going to be our interviewee. And some of you know Hugh from his wonderful videos, but let me give Hugh the floor for a few minutes just to talk about what he might talk about next time when we meet again.
And you're on mute, Hugh.
Well, first of all, David, I wanted to express my personal gratitude to you. I'm somewhat overawed by your erudition and scholarship, but you wear it lightly, which I appreciate very much. I never got the same impression of Krishnamurti. It seemed to me he took a lot of pleasure in his own erudition, almost to exclusion of really appreciating who he was sitting with when he was talking with David Bohm. But that's for another time. The session I've been encouraged to offer in a month's time by Nancy, or both of them, but Nancy became very interested in the music that I involved in the two films that I showed in a recent Academy of Professional Dialogue soiree. One film was inspired by the work of Martin Buber. The other film, more recent, that I made was inspired by the work of David Bohm. The two men have never been brought together in one place before. And the fact that they both had a very clear vision of how the key to interaction was not interconnectedness, was not interaction, but reciprocal relationship. And they both used this same language, and they both spoke in very similar terms, but the two constituencies that know each of those two men as a source of inspiration for dialogue hardly know of the other. So by bringing them together, I think the soiree in itself was of great interest. But behind all of that, there was the music of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, led by Daniel Barenboim, the conductor Daniel Barenboim, and the work he did with Edward Said, with the young musicians from Palestine, Israel, and the surrounding countries. Some of you will know of it. And I thought I wouldn't simply repeat a showing of the films. Many people have already seen the films together. I thought I would go further and actually touch on the very subject that you've raised, David, the whole question of emotion as not separate from thought. That Bohm demonstrated very clearly that emotion flowed through the body, was one with thought. Thought and emotion were not separate. And yet in our dialogue communities, very often, just as you described it in your paper, David, you spoke about a discrepancy that exists with respect to Bohmian dialogue. The prevailing image is one of harmony and cooperation, a forum in which the participants cultivate a spirit of cooperation without rancor or antagonism. And I've sat in many dialogues respectfully waiting for one person to speak at a time, or waiting for the stick to be passed to me. And I just found myself lighting up. Zofnat, I've not met you before, but when you spoke just then with great passion about what was preoccupying you, about the obsession with the individual self and so on, I became engaged. I became, this mattered to me because it mattered to you. I could see that it mattered. And that is absent from some of our circles, some of our carefully calibrated dialogic structures. which I don't think reflect the insights that David Bohm himself offered, except that he offered them in such steadily measured cerebral tones that his passion was not visible to many people, and certainly not visible on the films. And so what I think in this session we will be having in a month's time is that we will step aside from discourse, the dominant mode of relating as discourse, and correct some of the balance that is presently favoring dispassionate. There's a kind of dispassionate edge to so much of our practice, those of us for whom this is a matter of professional practice, that I would like to bring the music of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra and some of the material from the films to the service of surfacing and releasing and giving privilege to the power of emotion as an expression of thought, passionate thought. So that's the dedication. I've yet to think of a title. I've got 3 weeks to do that, but it would be for all of you on this particular session that David has led so eloquently and elegantly. I think it would be a natural follow-on, and I would encourage all of you to show up again if you would be willing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hugh. And several people, as you were talking, were saying, do we have a link to those videos? And Hugh, would you be willing to put links to one or more of those videos in the chat so that people could look at them ahead of time? I know we're still doing our planning about how much to show on the interview itself, but I think that would be quite helpful if you would be willing to do that.
Yeah, I'm certainly more than willing. I think I was not intending to show the films within the session in a month's time, and so I will be encouraging people who anticipate joining to have seen the films beforehand. And it's very easy to do that. We have the links to the Vimeo films of the soiree itself and of the films themselves. So the only decision will be how much to encourage you to look at before you show up. For those of you who might be daunted at what you're being asked to do, the first film that deals with the influence of Martin Buber is only 8 minutes long. And the film, A Moment of Clarity, that concerns the work of David Bohm, is 15 minutes. So they're really very short films. And I think that's all I seek to offer to using the title of that film, is a moment of clarity. That's why I was so admiring, David, of your eloquence, that it seems to me you're remarkably clear most of the time. My own experience, a long experience as it has been, is that most of the time I'm not clear, and I wait patiently for clarity to emerge from the relation. I depend on that. Without that, I flounder, I wait. And so it'll be quite a challenge for me to follow you, David, in a month's time and lead a session that is essentially offering just a moment of clarity.
Well, I think you'll do very well. I have no doubt.
We have just a moment for some clarity left before we close. Yeah. So this is a time for basically offering any impassioned or not impassioned reflections to David and the group. What stands out? What would you like to say as closing remarks? And just raise your hand and Nancy and I will call on you. Maria, did you have your hand up? No. Would like to offer.
Yes, you did.
You know, I feel very privileged to have heard you, David, because not so many people have frequented, or I've been around David Bohm and Krishnamurti as intensely as you have, and it gives a different feel. I realized that I correct my way of understanding how they related. I said, Pete put a lot of emphasis on the friction moments and the rupture of their relationship, and you put emphasis on the collaboration. And I appreciate the fact that you rebalance the element. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Other reflections, comments?
I have a couple things to share.
Sure,
if
David.
Nobody else does.
Go ahead.
Yes?
Yes, please.
Okay, I just want to make a couple of points. One of the great things about the way Bohm conveyed his understanding of the psychological field was the great metaphors and examples and little parables that he brought, which is something that Krishnamurti never did, but Bohm made things so much clearer sometimes. And I just wanted to mention a couple of his little metaphors. You know, in dialogue, it has been said that it's important to suspend. Suspension is part of the essence of the dialogue procedure, but what needs to be clarified is that what needs to be suspended are assumptions. We have assumptions underlying our conscious thoughts, and it's those assumptions which have to be suspended. And Bohm had a great metaphor for how we should hold on to our assumptions. He said assumptions are very useful, and it's good that we don't have to think about them most of the time, but we also have to be prepared to let them go if necessary. And he said it's like a blind man who's holding a stick to tap the ground ahead of him. If he holds the stick too tightly, it's useless, but if he holds it too loosely, then the stick will drop, and he can't make use of it. He said that's the way we should hold on to our assumptions. It's a great, beautiful metaphor. And if I can just offer one more quickly.
Sure.
With respect to the relationship between thought and perception of truth, perception of the unlimited. Bohm had another wonderful metaphor. He said, the activity of thought is like being in a city like Las Vegas at night, where all of the artificial lights are shining and they're so bright and they're so compelling, and it feels like that's the whole universe. But if those artificial lights are like the activity of thought, and if all of those artificial lights could be turned off, then we could see the infinite. We could see the stars shining, the light from the stars from, you know, unlimited distances, and you know, we would come upon something much, much greater than the you know, very attractive immediacy of the artificial lights that thought is always creating in our minds.
Those are lovely. Thank you, David. That was Robert.
I thank you so much for that, David. And I particularly wanted to, and I'm doing this now, post something from Martin Buber, which kind of ties everything together for me in this moment, particularly in relationship to some of the points that Safna raised as well. So I've just posted a little quote from Buber that might serve to care forward into and lean forward into the space between David and Hugh.
Nice, thank you. Any other quick comments? We just have a very few minutes left.
Someone's asked me for the links. I didn't intend to put the links on the chat line. The links will be available on the Academy website when we promote the session in a month's time. So okay. I imagine in about 2 weeks' time, the links will be available.
Thank you. And I noticed, Lloyd, you wanted to say something?
Yes, just a quick thank you for David for the presentation and reminding us, not just you, but several people who reminded us about the importance of relationships. And I want to acknowledge that I sense that that's a part of the field that we're in when we come together here, because Nancy and Linda have been leading us, but there are numerous people who are here every month, and I look forward to seeing them. And those relationships are a part of the power that we experience in our being together. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, we are pretty much out of time. So I think, Nancy, unless you have something else to contribute, I think we're good.
No, I'm just so appreciative, both of David, of your joining us, and of you're anticipating your conversation with us. So look forward to seeing all of you in a month.
Yes, you too. Thanks for
All right.
coming. See you guys.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was great.
It was a real pleasure.
See you all.
See you all.